Perfect. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Boundaries Committee. Thank you for the members of the committee that are joining us through Zoom, as well as the members that were able to join us in person. As we know that most of these meetings are going to happen on Zoom, but we thought it was important tonight to do it in person because we're able to be joined by our demographer, who we're going to have introduce herself in a minute here, who is leading this work. And so we thought it was an important session to have in person. I'm going to turn it over in a minute. She will be leading much of the discussion. We have three big objectives today that we are digging into. The first of them is to talk about the process and how we go from our current boundaries to even looking at a proposed new map. The second is around what is our data now. And that's data that's been shared already, but also data that you'll really get to know as we go through this process. And so I don't want us to get bogged down in what does our current data tell us, but know that we want you to get a sense of what data is available and what data will we be looking at and what questions will we be asking as we go along the way. And then the third, and this is where we really want to get to spend the bulk of our time tonight, is we want to spend it really wrestling as a committee, hearing from you of what are the priorities that we want to have as we do this work. Those are the priorities that the demographer and staff will use as they create any revisions to the boundaries map, or the iterations of the boundaries map that you'll be reviewing in this work. And so it's important that we get to starting to have an idea of what those priorities are, so that we can do that. And so we want to be able to save the bulk of that time for that discussion. And so with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to McKay to introduce yourself and then walk us through those pieces.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me all right? No, okay, good. Not used to having a microphone, so my apologies. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a presentation for you all. Let's see if I can share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that? All right. Okay. Thank you for having me here today. My name is McKay Larrabee. I'm actually from the other Portland, so my apologies for bringing the rain with me. I hope that I didn't do that solely, but it was nice and sunny out in Portland, and then I came here and it's nice and rainy. I am a project manager with MGT, formerly Davis Demographics. And so I wanted to go through a quick introduction of myself, as well as the company that I work for. I did want to get you guys on the same page as far as the data background, because we really want this to be a data-driven process. And then really want you all to start thinking about developing the guiding principles for this process, the criteria that I'm going to use with our team to produce some scenarios for you all. So today for the agenda, we're going to go through Data 101, which is a little bit boring except for the maps, the guiding principles overview, and then we'll have some discussion and decision-making on the guiding principles. So a little bit about MGT. We are nationally recognized, locally focused. I've been with MGT for about 1.5 years, but I've been doing this work for about 5.5, 6 years. I've been mainly in the boundary review, redistricting space, both in local government, but also in school districts. And I will say that school districts tend to be a little bit, the temperatures is hotter for school districts rather than local government, even though that can be contentious as well. But it's really important because these are families that we're talking about and students at the heart of all these processes. So we have a lot of information here. Essentially, we have a lot of years under our belt with forecasting and boundary reviews, as well as master planning projects and student forecast reports. At the core of what we do, the data piece is really important. We are spatial thinkers, and so we're thinking about spatial data at all times. My background is I have about 18 years of GIS experience, so a lot of experience in that route. Here's an overview of the boundary review framework and timeline. Past couple of months have been, we've been working on student forecasting, the challenge statements, what are the issues facing the district, enrollment patterns, and I have some of that I'll share with you this evening. And then we're in the phase of initiation. So really understanding the data, because it is a data-driven process, developing those guiding principles, and then also looking at your current boundaries, which some districts aren't generally speaking, they're not looking at a map, right? They're looking at where their house is on that map. So we want to look at the entire district and how your attendance areas are set up. And then into October through January of 2025, we'll look at boundary options. This is iterative scenarios where we're looking at what makes sense for the district and what doesn't make sense for the district. Obtaining feedback from the committee, leadership, the community, and getting some consensus on boards so that everyone understands the decision-making and the final decision. And then the final boundary in February or March, where we'll share all the maps, the statistical reports, and the board vote. This is a framework that I think is really important to hit all of these pieces. Otherwise, we're not going to set this process up for success. So we really need the process to be transparent. So sharing our data sources and the data pieces behind it, having frequent updates with you all and the community throughout. It's collaborative. We need to decide on guiding principles, those criteria. You all have a charge, and then consensus building within. It's iterative, so we're going to go through several iterations. And I say this later, but what doesn't work is almost more important than what does. That means that you're doing your due diligence and really looking at all options. It's informative. The public understands the inputs, and they understand the decision criteria. And this one, I think, is at the heart of what I do, which is the more technical piece, which is data-driven. You need to understand the forecast factors. If we just looked at today's information, you could be solving a problem that is not a problem in 5 years. Or you could be looking at an issue that is a problem in 5 years, but you haven't identified it. So having that integration of the forecast is extremely important. Understanding how that forecast is developed is really important. And then we'll talk about enrollment modeling and the integration of the forecast into our boundary scenario modeling. Excuse me. So to start off the Data 101, this is the data-driven piece of this whole process. We start off with taking spatial and tabular data, meaning attribute data, and we set that up with the district. We research active and proposed and future developments, housing developments within the district. We look at current and future demographic trends within the district, and then we develop the population forecasts by grade and by attendance area for the next 10 years. Keep in mind with a forecast, as you go out, that confidence gets lower. So you're going to have more accuracy closer up. So it is important. Some committees really want to look at what would this look like in 10 years. That's very difficult to say. It's more, the spread is just higher. It's bigger. So looking at the next 5 years is a better indication of what the district might look like under these scenarios. Okay, so the student projections flowchart. These are essentially the ingredients to the student forecast, which is the meal. That's probably a horrible way to look at it, but if you understand these birth factors, you understand the data going into the forecast. The 3 factors are birth factors. The birth factors are going to influence how many kindergartners you have 5 years later. We also have a lot of birth data, and we only have the current year kindergartners. So we need a way to develop some trends so that we're looking at when students are born within the district and how many actually show up in the district. So we'll talk about that capture rate as well. The mobility forecasts or factors are essentially grade progression ratios. Some folks think of them in that respect. It's how many first graders end up in second grade, end up in third grade. And we look at these geographically. So we're looking at them at the elementary attendance area, knowing that we can still garner how many ninth graders stay for 10th grade by looking at that geography, knowing that they're not actually going to elementary school. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the student yield factors. We gain student yield factors by looking at all students throughout the district, current and historical, that are living in what type of housing type: multifamily attached, single family detached, single family attached, apartment buildings. We look at how many students are in there. That way we can predict for a housing unit that's going in that has 100 units of single family detached homes, how many students you can likely produce from those developments. So that gets into the planned residential development. So with the kindergarten class, we get mainly from trends, looking at birth data. Student cohorts, we're looking at mobility across all grades. And with the planned residential development, we're using those student yield factors to predict what's going to happen in the future. Those are your student forecasts. We start with a student verification form. This lets us be on the same page with the district. It's a check to make sure that data is clean and we're all on the same page. And then we geocode each of the students. So this is 4 years of student data, the current year and 3 years prior. And so this is actually placing the student at their home. So now that we know where they live, we can understand how many live in what container, being your attendance areas. We can also look at the movement of students. Are families aging in place? Are there lots of resales? Are there a lot of apartment complexes? Is there a lot of student movement? We can look at that over a 4-year average. And then this is really important piece, the study areas. So the study areas are what I think of, if you think of Lego building blocks. So the Legos all fit together to make your attendance areas. So I think of these as communities of mutual interest. There's about 50 to 75 students in each. And the forecasts that we run are done at the study area geography, so that we can sum them up in any way we would like. We can also look at them in different configurations geographically. So these study areas are really important. You have 692. Some of that is because of some snippets in the islands, but for the most part, it's a lot of study areas and a lot of options to deal with. The important part of this is that I wanted to say that these study areas are created so that a lot of times we will cut these to make sure that we're using parcel breaks. So if my kiddo plays with the kiddo across the street, my kiddo does not play with the kiddo in the fence behind. They just don't. Apparently they can't go around the block and see them, but they're generally playing this way. And so we don't want to put that line right down that street if we don't have to. So we're really taking the time to be conscious of where those study areas and how those study areas are cut. This is your student density here. As you can see, the darker red to yellow means higher concentration of students. You can also tell by this that your school locations for your elementary schools are actually really well placed right now. It indicates that that you have neighborhood schools currently. These are the historic and live birth factors. So you're looking at, this is the year of the birth rate or the births by residents, and this is the kinder year. So births, and then 5 years later is the kinder year. So we're looking at total number of births was 760 in 2013. That garnered 490 kindergartners 5 years later. So your capture rate is 64%. So a lot of movement happens between birth and kinder, but what we can look at is both the rate of decline or increase in birth rates. Yes.
Sorry, is it okay to interrupt with a question?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you did. I was kind of looking. Yeah, sure.
Is our resident capture rate relatively typical or is it an outlier?
It is. That's a great question. It is typical. I have very few districts that are over 100%. Very few that are actually over 75. So I see 50% to 75 as being the usual. You usually don't get over 100% unless you have a ton of development or a new industry that's happened in your district. But it's usually just around this because there's just so much movement. But what we can say is that your capture rate has increased a little bit, but we expect it to level off going forward. And while your births have decreased over the last few years, it's not enough to really move the needle. And, most of the United States has pretty severe declining births. I'm not seeing that here. So your birth factors are going to be very close to 1. Which is good because birth factors, if you have pretty declining births, then you're not going to get that kindergarten cohort in. And you need so much residential development to override the declining births. So you're actually at a pretty smooth, even way with your birth factors, which is also shown here in your resident kindergarten cohort. There's not a ton of fluctuation in either of those. This is a look at your mobility. And so, again, this is at the elementary attendance area geography. So again, you don't have any 12th graders in East End Elementary, but we want to have the smallest geography so that we're looking at student movement within those geographies. We want to see how many first graders are actually going to second grade in that geography, how many fifth graders are going to sixth grade in that geography. And so if you look at this, 1 just means you're not gaining any students from grade to grade, you're not losing any students from grade to grade. And some of these, Cliff Island and Peaks Island, have been modified from our 4-year average just because it's a unique situation. And we had to look at smaller populations like that. We just have to take a straight factor. But for your other mobility pieces, for Lyseth, you have 1.05, which means that from K to 1, which means that if you have 100 kindergartners in Lyseth, you've got 105 going into the next school year. So
sorry, quick question.
Yes.
Is this based on, is this longitudinal in terms of it's following individual students, or is this just based on the counts at the end of each year?
It is counts of each October, which is your stable and enrollment period. So we are looking at the most recent, which was October of 2023, because we don't have this year's data yet.
Okay. So, but this could be would never happen. But for example, this could be the kindergarten completely changed in who the students were, but as long as the same number of students moved in, then we would still have a 1 and it would look like nobody had moved.
Correct. It is a net. It's a net in and out. And so the students, and this is a 4-year average, so we're looking at 2020, 21, 22, and 23.
Got it.
And so this will pick up on any move-ins or move-outs, apartment complexes, private school movement. We don't have, since those students wouldn't be in your student information system, we just see them as net out. And so it gives us the concept of characterizing types of things like aging in place or resales in certain areas. So what's more desirable or stable, and what's a net out.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. I'm just trying to think about, some really weird things have happened in the last few years where a lot of families have moved due to COVID. And also we've had a lot more people coming in because of COVID than traditionally. And just trying to get my head around, to what extent can we measure that and account for that in the future prediction?
Yes, so that's a really good point. We did take, your district is an outlier with the number of students coming in that might be temporarily housed or more mobile. We took a detailed look at each of the study areas where there were major movements, and we took them out of those study areas, out of this mobility matrix. They are still included in the forecast, but we needed the mobility that was causing an artificial mobility, right? For a regular district. So for this actual analysis, those study areas were taken out of this analysis. And so this is just your stable, normal mobility. If we took out the artificial mobility of large numbers of students moving from attendance area to attendance area.
Okay, so sorry, how do you identify them? Like, are we talking about families that might have moved here from abroad seeking asylum, or are we talking about, the families who have moved from other cities because they just wanted more space?
No, that's that natural mobility that I'm talking about of natural immigration or emigration. What we took out is in the, we have the demographics for each student. So we're making sure that when there is, I do an analysis at each study area. So if there's a jump of like 50 students or a drop of 50 students, and there's not a new development in that area, then I know it's not because of a new development. So I don't want to include that increase or decrease. And so those specific study areas were taken out of this mobility.
Got it.
So does that help?
Yeah, so essentially just to make sure I understand it, it sounds like we don't know where the students that are excluded are coming from or really their backgrounds. But we just know we're just assuming it was an abnormal thing that brought them here, and thus we don't need to forecast for similar patterns in the future.
Correct. And those students are still included in our forecast. They are just not included in this mobility analysis.
Got it.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe. We'll get there.
Okay. So one thing to point out is that you do have high mobility in your 12th grade. That's generally what we see across the board. This happens when you have the second year seniors. You also see quite a bit of upward mobility from K to 1. Those are students coming in from other private preschools that are doing private kindergarten elsewhere and coming in and joining in first grade. So you generally see a jump in kindergarten to first and in 11th to 12th. You do have really good inward mobility for your entire high school, which could be the lack of parochial high schools in the district. I'm not quite sure, but you do have a good inward mobility there. You do generally see this 5th to 6th drop off. This is where 5th graders, any kind of grade group break, you're going to have different choice. This is family choice. It's either moving or changing schools or going outside of the district or choosing other pieces. We do definitely see a drop off from 5 to 6 usually. And you do have lower inward mobility when we're talking about elementary school in general. It is lower. I'm not going to say that it's lower than a lot of other districts that I work with, but it is to note that there's not a ton of inward mobility in your elementary years. This is a look at your housing development. We work with local jurisdictions and developers to understand the development landscape. So we have meetings with them, sit with them. We do development drives. We use high-res imagery to look at how the development is coming along. You have about 1,000 total units that are expected throughout the next 10 years. And then they are mostly apartments, but you do have some multifamily attached and single-family detached, but only one. So for looking at how many students are going to come out from these, we do these student yield factors that I just mentioned earlier, where we look at the number of students and the number of units. So for example, single-family detached, We looked at 11,461 units. Of those units, you had 2,765 students in them, and we look at it at the K-5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. That way we can determine that if there are 100 units of single-family detached development going in, it's going to produce around 24 students, grades K through 12. And so when you see a ton of development going in, I oftentimes tamper this with, okay, we're talking about a ton of units, but there's not a kid in every one of those units. You're talking about fractions, and you're talking about the phasing of those developments over the next 5 or 10 years. So we're going to take a minute and capture any questions you might have. I know I answered a couple of those, and I think we're behind on time.
Let's do this just for time's sake.
Yeah.
If you have questions, write them down. We'll capture them later. We're just throwing off a little bit with our document on that, but
Okay.
just write them down. We'll catch them later, and then we'll share them with McKay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so attendance and forecast. So this is a look. I'm sure you know what your district looks like. This just puts it in a visual sense with your attendance areas. These are colored by elementary school, and you have the elementary school locations on them as well. And so just wanted to let you know that this is out here, and we do have a school locator that we can look at if we do have time, but we do need for everyone to spend some time and really look at the current attendance areas. There's some oddities just because of transportation and the way that some of these attendance areas follow the backs of parcels, which is what they're supposed to do. Again, if a bus is riding down a road, you want to pick up kiddos on both sides of that road. But take some time to review your attendance areas. But I do want to get to this. This is your attendance matrix, and it's a lot to take in. So I'm going to walk you through one of these. I'm going to walk you through Ocean Avenue as an example. What this is showing is how many students live within the attendance area and how many students go to what school. So if we look at Ocean Avenue here, you've got the grade range. We already know it's elementary. This is the number of students living within Ocean Avenue. So this is not the number of students that go to Ocean Avenue. Out of these 289 students, 6 attend East End, 5 attend Longfellow, 5 attend Lyseth, and 256 actually attend Ocean Avenue. So you're capturing not that whole group because there's movement because of your policy, right? And so on and so forth. You've got 11 students that live in Ocean Ave and go to Reiki. So there's some outliers in here. If we look down the column, we see that where students are being pulled from into what school. So if we're looking at Ocean Ave, we see that 27 students live in East End and attend Ocean Avenue. 5 live in Longfellow's attendance area and attend Ocean Ave. 8 come from Lyseth. 256 actually come from their own attendance area, and so on and so forth. So you have 341 students that attend Ocean Ave from inside your district, from all these schools above. 14 students come to Ocean Ave from outside of your district. Those are the interdistrict transfers. And then 1 student has invalid address, say a PO box or something that we couldn't match to an actual address. So the total enrollment in October of 2023 was 356 students at Ocean Avenue. So I say this all to say that our forecasting is residence-based. Our brains are enrollment-based, right? A principal is going to say, this is the number of students I have in my school. They are never going to say that I have 289 students in my school. But we need to think from a residence perspective because that's going to give us the best outcomes for long-term changes. This is the influence of your policy and choice throughout the district. So it's something that is just important to note and keep your eye on because it is a mind change. It's a thought process to change from enrollment to residence, and we need to be in a residence kind of mindset.
And sorry, does that include kids who go to private school or no?
No, because they're not in the student enrollment system. It's only students that we have in the system. So this is a look at the elementary school utilization. So this is looking at, if we looked again at East End, we see that the school capacity is 466. There are 434 students that live within that attendance area. So if everyone that lived there went there, they would be at 93%. But a lot of those students, more net students leave that attendance area than join that attendance area. So you end up with 396 students for 85% utilization. So this can show us some differences in how we look at boundaries. Ocean Ave is 64% if everybody that lived there went there, but we are looking at almost 80% utilized because of the net increase in students coming in. So it's just an important piece to look at and be cognizant of when you're making decisions that we're really looking in the residence piece. The enrollment piece is where implementation comes in. It's where decision-making on the policy side comes in. This is a look at the middle school matrix. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but very similar. If you look at Lincoln, you can see how many students live within Lincoln and how many students actually attend Lincoln. And if you look at the attendance for Lincoln, it gives you that down here. And then the same utilization piece on the right. So we put this information all together and we get to your district-wide forecasts. So this is with the mobility, the birth rates, and the housing development. And so what pops out to everyone, I think, first of all, as you look at it, it really does bring your eye to the red. This is going to pull out cohorts that might be smaller or cohorts that are bigger. And so in general, this is mostly affecting your high school grades right now because you had traditionally, you've had pretty high cohorts in your high schools, and those are being replaced by smaller cohorts coming in. These cohorts started back in second grade in 2020. It might have been a COVID dip, and there might have been some bounce back, but this is all historic information from 2020, 21, 22, and 23. This is all known data. So these trends we expect are going to continue down the line. And so what you have is some drop off in the high school. That's just because you've got 521 seniors being replaced by 453 ninth graders coming in the next year. So that kind of that turnover is going to depress those high school numbers. But overall, your actual PK through 5 numbers are pretty steady. They are expected to go up slightly and then settle in somewhere around where you are now. The 6-8 trend is set to have a bit of a drop as that smaller cohort moves through in the next 5 years, and then it's expected to also have some lift in the back half of the forecast, the 5 to 10 year. And that's where I'm talking about the 9-12 having that decline is just because of that smaller cohort coming through where you have 4 grades, and those are going to continue to see some depression in the high school numbers.
So all the forecasting is based on COVID years?
No, the forecast is based on 2020, 21, 22, and 23. It's based on the birth factors, the mobility factors, and the housing development. But these are trends that we can start to see where there are smaller cohorts that are continuing to filter through the system that didn't have that COVID bounce back.
Okay, I guess I'm just, those are such the craziest years in 100 years. And so, wouldn't it be valuable to include 2018 and 2019 and see how much it changes? So
the issue with that is that we're dealing with a new paradigm. All demographers are. So when you have a massive pandemic, it throws off everyone. right?
forever.
Everybody's trends are in the trash. And so demographers for a long time, every year that we get new data is like a gift to us because it's a more stabilized population. So if we're looking at trends, that's what we have to that's what we have to predict off of. Is
Okay.
our projections are essentially looking at trends. We do capture that bounce back because we are still looking at what's happened since COVID.
Yeah.
But it is, if we went back before, what we see nationally is that if you have declining enrollment, there was either a jump or a dump right around COVID, and then that's coming back to the same trend. If you had stable enrollment prior and there was an up or down, that is going to stabilize in the future as well. We're not seeing any major, I haven't worked in any district where I've seen a trend prior to COVID
Reemerge.
get mixed up a little bit in COVID and then kind of stabilize. It might have stabilized at a lower level or a higher level depending on where you live, but that trend is still going to maintain from what we can tell from the data.
Do you like heavily weight year 2022 and see if the estimates change?
We can in certain, we can do weighted mobility, and we actually tried weighted mobility earlier in this process, and it ended up skewing data even worse. And I think that's because you have an unusual district with your population.
Great.
And so you've got a lot of outliers that we're dealing with. And so when we try to weight 2023, I mean, if you look at 2023, you had a massive increase, right? You had this dip, and then you went from 6,284 students to 6,426 students. So the trend there's no trend to get to. So what you have to do is dig into the by grade and by attendance area and really look at the trend wise because it's the best data that we have.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
This is looking at the elementary by school. This is your 5 and 10-year range. And I will say this is a tiny bit misleading just because Peaks Island is shown to have such a large percentage jump. That's not super fair to the other schools because Peaks Island is a much smaller population. So when you have the growth of 2 students, you're going to see massive increases that aren't necessarily reflected in these smaller schools. But what I will say is that we have seen that we are predicting increases at East End, Reiki, and Rowe, and looking at decreases overall over the 5 and 10-year period at Ocean Ave, Longfellow, Lyseth, and Presumpscot. And middle school is a different bag, and that's because in the 5-year, there's not set to be so much drop off. But then that Lincoln and Moore get a lot of that smaller cohort that's filtering through. So that's why they have a larger decrease in the 10-year. King is set to gain the most in the 10-year, but not in the 5-year. So keep going.
I mean, I think same thing. I got to remember the mic.
Okay.
Same thing, like take a minute to capture any questions that you may have. And if we have time at the end, we're going to go back to those questions while we have McKay here. But we do want to make sure we get to the priorities piece. Great.
I think before we get to guiding principles, I think that the thing that I really do appreciate about our forecast is that a lot of demographers they're not super transparent with their factors. They don't share study areas, and they don't share, how they're looking at the district. And we have that all available to you. Not a lot of folks are going to share their birth factors or their mobility. But if you understand the factors, you understand the data, so you can understand the issues that you're facing. So I think it's really important to recognize that that the faith in the data is going to be really important for this process. So just wanted to stop off and give a plug for the data because data trends really, it's hard to it's hard to challenge data trends when it's actual data. Okay, so we're going to kind of change tracks and go into our guiding principles. So this is the meat of what we need to discuss with you tonight. So what are guiding principles? They seem very theoretical. They are until they come into practice. And so I think of guiding principles as a way to guide the boundary scenarios that we'll be looking at. They help with the decision making. They act as criteria to measure the effectiveness of a boundary option against one another. So it's a comparative way to look at things. They give context to your decisions. So it is a way for you to be transparent about your decision making with the public, with the leadership. It's a way that you can really think about these boundaries and give criteria to myself and my company to help make that successful. They also allow the public to understand your decision making. I think of them as a rule book for consensus. So it is a way when a challenging boundary option comes up, and if you have your criteria, you can really sit in that and say, okay, that satisfies that one. It does not satisfy that one. But how does this work with the other, 4 or 5? Does this rise to the top? It also allows you to look at boundary options and look at what doesn't work, right? This doesn't satisfy any of our criteria. So let's throw it out. And when the public says, why didn't you do this? You can say, okay, we actually did look through this and it didn't meet any of our criteria. It met one of our criteria that we didn't think was far enough to push that option along. So it is a way that you can be transparent about your decision making. And again, moral of the story is understanding what doesn't work, again, is almost as important as finding out what does. That due diligence, somebody else is going to have that idea of why you didn't do it. So we should definitely do it and do our due diligence and figure out why. These are examples. So our guiding principles are, generally speaking, these 5 categories. Can you streamline your transportation? Can you minimize impact to the entire district or to students and families? Can you balance demographics? Can you create neighborhood schools? And can you balance utilization? Now, a lot of these conflict with one another, and you're never going to be able to get an A on all of your guiding principles, but it's really important that you have them all for that push and pull. So that conflict piece is really important. Working with committees, I do see certain criteria kind of percolate to the top, but they should not be prioritized. That should be a natural instinct as you go through and work on different options, that those guiding principles, one might sit more with one person, one might sit more with another person, depending on your specialty, your career, your student. It depends on a lot of things, but they all are really important to interplay with one another. So they can also be used to identify unintended consequences. Did we move this block to this attendance area, and did we just make the situation worse? Did we make it better? Did we make it worse? So maybe we didn't do a good job there. Let's see if there's another way to get there. This is that complexity that I was talking about. So if you balance utilization, you could have balanced class sizes, smaller class sizes, equitable access to things like specials. There's fiscal benefits for equalizing your staffing. Your challenges, though, is that you could be imbalancing your socioeconomic indicators, increasing transportation costs, and students might not be going to their closest school. If you were to balance demographics, you could potentially have equitable resources at all of your schools, increase diversity and equitable opportunities throughout the district. However, you could have uneven utilization. You could increase your transportation costs. Students might not be able to go to their closest school, or you could create boundary islands, detached islands from the actual attendance area. Minimizing impact, this is always really popular with communities because not a lot of people are affected, right? It's you minimize impact, you affect as few students as possible. Some part of this can be used with phasing your changes over time. All third, fourth, and fifth graders can finish where they're going before they have to change into their normal middle school. That's an implementation talk. That's not a talk necessarily for now, but it's something to think about. The problem with minimizing impacts is that you could be causing problems that are just going to have to be somebody else's problem down the road instead of dealing with them now. Okay, so with that, I want to go through some examples. And again, these are examples. I've worked with a lot of committees. My company's worked with a lot of committees. These have percolated up to the top. They capture a predominant voice that I hear in communities across America. And so these are guiding principles that you do not have to choose verbatim. You can change your verbiage. But in general, it's best practices to have 5 or 6 guiding principles that are most important to the work that you're going to be doing. And I categorize these, I put them into those 5 categories to try to think about some of these work together again. Some of them conflict with one another. But if you wanted to do 5 to 6, then I think it would be important to choose one from each category. So you've got utilization, which is balanced utilization at current 5 and 10-year forecasted trends. Again, verbiage can change on these, but utilization is essentially utilization. How many students are in what building and how big is that building? How many seats can that building fit? Demographics, we've got a couple here. Taking a district-wide perspective by considering socioeconomic, linguistic, and racial diversity within and across schools, and minimize disruption and impacts to special programs or special populations, e.g. free and reduced lunch programs, economically disadvantaged, and special education students. For neighborhood schools, we have work to maintain neighborhood schools and avoid island zones where small sections are detached from their surrounding areas and assigned to different boundaries. We talked about that in the previous slide. For transportation, transportation is super important because sometimes there's ideas that you all might not see, but the transportation folks are going, we can't take a left there. So transportation is really important in these processes. We have consider transportation impacts and work towards limiting the amount of time required on a bus and maximize proximity to home and walkability, i.e. avoiding busy streets, railroad tracks, consider the natural boundaries, of which you have a lot. And then minimize impact. That's minimizing the number of students impacted by a boundary adjustment, making efforts to maintain the feeder system, and making efforts to keep siblings in the same school. So those are the 10 that we've come up with for examples. And I think this gets into discussion and decision time.
Yeah, and so if you want to pull down your screen,
Yes.
I'll put up a screen just so we have the same things. We're gonna take McKay off the presentation stage here for a minute and really open it up to a discussion for the committee, to hear from the committee about how they consider, how you individually think about prioritizing within this and what you would like to see. And you can use the ones up there as examples as starting spots. You could pose changing language. We will ask you at some point to sort of give an indication of what ones you would want to prioritize. Again, we're not going to rank them. We're not going to vote. Like, we're not going to say 1, 2, 3, but sort of hopefully get to a spot where the weight of the committee is clearly on a group of them. But would love just first open it up to a conversation, and I'll sort of put them up on the screen. Dr. Warren here is going to capture them on some poster paper for local here, and then I have them electronically.
Ask a logistical question.
Yeah. Can you speak into the mic just so they can hear you at home?
Sorry, logistical question.
Yep.
Trying to look at the examples that you gave us on the slides that, oh, they're on there already. Oh, terrific. Okay. Because on the slides that we have, the categories aren't there.
Yeah, I should lean in there. When I was thinking about this meeting, slapping a bunch of words up there, it didn't seem, you know what I mean? I need categories. I need kind of organization. And so I added that afterwards because I was thinking about your decision making, and we had just talked about these 5 pillars of these guiding principles. And so I added those so they are different from your original slides. My apologies on that. I just thought it would be more focused.
It's fine. I'll put them up here and type up in here as well. So, and I'm happy to go back and forth between folks in the room who want to share as well as folks on Zoom who want to share.
Sorry.
Yeah, either way.
Just go ahead. So this is Damon. I guess like for background, I'm just curious, when was the last time the district redistricted, and what were the factors that were prioritized then? Because I think that's important for considering how we're moving ahead now.
I actually don't know the answer to that. You know?
I do not know the answer to that. I will say that before there might be somebody that knows, but in working with districts over the last 5.5 years, there are very few people that are in those districts that do these processes more than once. And so a lot of times there's not that muscle memory. It's like when the census comes out and everybody has to redistrict and everybody's like, oh, I wasn't here. I don't know what, so it's hard to have that framework from before, but I just don't know.
And Dr. Opperman was saying she remembers when it was. So.
Hi, Julie Opperman. What precipitated the moves in various neighborhoods was because they closed school. Nathan Clifford, which was near the university, and consequently in that, people from a large part went to Row. Some went to Ocean from that community, so that's where they went.
I had this is Ariel. I had sort of a similar question to Damon, which was maybe sort of these 5 priority areas, how well is our existing system working? And this might be too detailed to get into, but in thinking about where we want to go and what we want to prioritize, I guess I'm curious about how we're already doing in these 5 areas, and that might help us figure out what our community cares most about.
Do you want me to speak from a data perspective, or you've got?
Well, I mean, I was going to say a little bit of that answer is a relative one, right? So on one of the slides that was shared, you can see a utilization by building. And so we have, unfortunately, I'm sharing right now. And so you can see a utilization that it ranges. I think the lowest one is Longfellow. If I have it right, it was around like 65%. 68. I knew there was a curve in the second number. And then the second, and then the high was in the 90s, right? So it's like a pretty significant. When Reiki was at 90, what was it? 93, right? So there's a pretty significant range there. And then demographics, we saw that on demographics, when we looked at it in the introductory meeting, I think there was a 50-point difference in socioeconomic. And so one of the things in my conversation with McKay was, if the committee said we want that to be balanced, equal, that is an impossible task because communities are also by their nature uneven. And so trying to get to equal is not possible. The question is, from a committee charge, is 50% right? Or is that something that is the committee saying, no, we want to take a step in that direction? I think that's what is the thing you're wrestling with now.
I have just a follow-up question to that then. I'm curious, what it might look like if we were to, say, optimize all of these factors. For example, have a computer just pick out one by one and see what's the optimal map to maximize each one. For example, for utilization, what if we had a computer-generated map that showed what it would look like if all students attended the nearest possible school and all utilization rates were set to the same amount for each school? Oh, what would that look like? And so forth, and say, well, what would it look like if we optimized demographics? It might be a crazy looking map, but it might be useful in our analysis. Same with neighborhood schools, transportation. And I think it would be interesting to look at, well, what would it look like if, we nailed all of these 100% best we possibly could, and then see what the differences are. I think that would help establish some of the trade-offs. I don't know if that's possible to generate some of those scenarios, but I think just suggesting that might be useful.
It is a good point, and we do have those models. And and this is mostly from working in redistricting for counties and local governments. It gives you crazy. It gives you so much change that would be so hard to digest. And what happens is when you just work from the numbers, you end up breaking massive amounts of communities of mutual interest in half, because you're just looking at a spatial representation of numbers, and they are uneven depending on where you live. And so we can show you something like that in some of the criteria, not all. But I will say that from a perspective of building actual options, I've never seen it work out where it's like, let's just look at what a computer would do, and I really do appreciate the feedback. It's just that I've seen it, and I was going to try to see if I could do it for you right now, but it's gonna break community. And so I think if that's at the heart of your charge, then it might not be a useful scenario, rather than look at individual changes. So from a data perspective.
Yeah, just to clarify, the reason I'd like to see that is I want to see how far we're away from actually achieving these goals, looking at each one individually. That's what I would think it'd be useful for. I'm not suggesting we use a computer to actually just do this and say our work is done here.
It would be awesome if we could.
I mean, I'm just going to go online here. Annie, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I wanted to take a step back and ask people to think about what the larger purpose of redistricting is. And that kind of raises this like really important fundamental question of like, what do we want our kids to get out of school? And how do we achieve that with the redistricting? Because we have like 60 years of research that can tell you about busing and outcomes of that, and demographic compositions of students and how it affects math scores, like future earnings, student happiness, et cetera. And so there is like research on really all of these things that we want to consider basically. But I think we have to first figure out like, what are we trying to achieve?
It's not an answer, but I really like her point.
You just need to do it into the mic.
Thank you. Like, I don't have to press anything, right? Okay. So it's not an answer, but it's just a point that I wanted to make. I really like the presentation. It made me understand a lot of how this system works. But throughout the entire presentation, one point that's stuck to me is that, so we are a district with more than 10%, I want to say by the end of the school year, experiencing homeless, and that affects a lot on the enrollment. And when you explain about the student projection flow chart, I did not see the consideration of that. And I honestly think that we need to start looking into those numbers because the projection, like you mentioned, that Ocean Ave for St. Scott numbers will probably go down. And right now, those are the two schools that we are enrolling most of the kids that are experiencing homeless. So that was surprising to me to see that those numbers would go down because currently those numbers are the ones going up because it's the schools that we are enrolling the kids who are experiencing homeless for many reasons. So I'm just wondering, like, how can we work on those projections and have those be accurate?
So I just want to be clear that those projections are based on resident population. So it's where students are residing, not where they're enrolled. And so that's why you're seeing maybe that that what you're thinking is happening. That's because we see what's happening, right? When we're doing enrollment projections, we're looking at resident population, so where students are residing now and in the past 3 years. So if we're just looking at resident population without McKinney-Vento students or taking those, and I can't say we're not taking those students out of the projections, we're taking them out of the natural mobility of your district. They are included in the resident population projections. So residence is just different from enrollment. So it is a change in thought because enrollment is based on policy largely and not on necessarily where students are living. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it does make sense. So pretty much like right now, if the families are experiencing homeless, we always use one particular address. So that's probably why you have in the map that very red section, because that is the address that we are using it. But that doesn't mean that the students are currently living in that.
Correct. And so that movement, especially when those students are moving to other areas or areas that are shelters or different facilities, those are pieces that, at least if I can identify a major jump or a major dip, those were taken out of the mobility piece.
And what I hear from your question, Priscilla, a little bit, and I'm not actually pushing the conversation towards the idea of like setting a priority on this, but one of the things I hear that needs to be thought of in this process is the impact of any changes on our McKinney-Vento students.
Yes, and that's the major reason why our policy is like on enrollment. When we choose schools, we are always thinking ahead on where those families will probably end up finding housing, so it can minimize the impact of the students. Like you said, one of the priorities, minimizing the impact. So we are always trying to think a little bit ahead. We can never predict what's going to happen, but we are always trying to think of what can we do to minimize the impact.
And I think that gets to a little bit about how we think of it from a priority end, but then also to McKay's point earlier about not just the enrollment trend, but also the policy about how do we think about where do we set aside seat and availability, right? Because we know that there are certain seats that are schools that are really receivers on this and other schools that are not, based on a number of factors. And what does that mean for demographics of schools, population, et cetera, opportunities, as something to consider. Yeah. Looking for others who have thoughts, comments, things you want to share when we're thinking about priorities on this.
I'll chime in just based on experience. I don't know if we're at the stage where we want to actually recommend or say which bullet points we prefer, but I kind of like G. We live in an area called Deering Triangle. It's sort of like you're getting really close to Morrow's Corner, and we're supposed to go to Talbot, but to get to Talbot, we have to go through Morrow's Corner, or if we were to go to Ocean Ave, you'd have to cross Forest Ave. So instead we attend Longfellow, and it just makes a whole lot more sense. And I guess I'd like to see other students to sort of participate in that sort of walking school experience if possible.
I have a question. I saw it earlier, and it was it wasn't a comment, but in the presentation about the equitable access to specials. Are the specials inequitably accessible at the schools? Are there some schools not have the same access to specials, not specialized education, but like art and gym and those sort of things?
Within our schools, when you think about the elementary schools, for the most part, they're equitable. The one example that would jump out is the Spanish immersion program at Lyseth. It's sort of the one that really jumps out. There are others where there's a small difference of specials at elementary schools, but for the most part, there's equitable access, as I think about it. I think where you'd probably get to more inequitable, if you were doing it, is thinking about where there are specialized programs. And so where students who are attending specialized programs for students with IEPs, where they're able to participate within their community versus where they're participating in another community. That's what, at least top of mind, comes out to me on this.
I have a question as well. Could we create like a priority list, like with, which ones we want to focus on the most, and then work down and see if the ones below are satisfied by doing a higher priority option? I guess, is this list going to be ranked, whatever we come up with tonight?
So we're actually trying to avoid a little bit ranking of it, just because of the competing is the wrong term, but the fact that one acts on the other. And so we want to look at how they act on each other whenever we're doing it. And we don't want to assume that it's just this one. And we serve that priority first and then this next one. At least that's the thought on the work, as McKay sort of described it. That said, right, if there's obviously like a very strong weighting in the conversation towards one or two factors, that is obviously going to influence how she approaches the work, right? That's what we're trying to get from the committee.
That makes sense.
I have a question too. Then, are there any changes anticipated to the school capacity over the next 5 to 10 years? And has there been any change since the analysis was initiated, I guess?
Not since the analysis has been, the capacities were given to us by the district years ago. From my perspective, they have not changed in a while. I don't know if there's anyone here that, besides closing the school, I just have the numbers from the district. I don't know if they've
thinking
changed.
of the renovations, for example, that have taken place and how that may factor in.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can think of that would impact this, but it would be a long way out, is if there was a decision on the elementary side around a renovation of Talbot, because that's really the one that sort of is the outstanding renovation. We just submitted to that for the state for major construction. That is a significant timeline. So it would likely be that that work would play out in the next boundary revision committee, not this one.
I don't know if there are any folks online who are trying to be talking, and I want to make sure that.
I'm monitoring it.
Okay.
They have not raised hand or jumped in.
Well, in that case, I'll jump in again. It seems like a lot of the things that we're raising are like the next step in the process. And I think that might be because we need to try to do all these things. We at least need to do all 5 of these categories. And so to me, to some extent, it makes more sense to do it in the opposite direction, which is let's play around with the different factors and the different options and see what potential scenarios come out of it, and then look at these factors in the context of those proposed scenarios and kind of try to figure out what feels like a good balance. Because we're not going to say any of these things aren't important. So
I think that for me, doing this work, you all, and again, they are very similar in each of those categories, right? But if I just start willy-nilly looking at, I'm going to look at utilization, because that is what I can do, and I can compare, and that is something that I can do with the data. I can look at the other factors, but if you tell me neighborhood schools have got to be on there, I know that might not mesh up with some of the other factors, but at least I have it in my head. Okay, neighborhoods are really important. This is not to say that taking 5 of these off of here, because some of them are really similar to one another, that I'm not going to be thinking from that perspective. I'm going to be thinking from each of these 5 perspectives, but I need to hear from you all how to narrow that version. Otherwise, I'm going to prioritize the thing that I can do, which is utilization. Which, I mean, that is something that I can do. I think having this local piece of just giving me a little bit more direction would help structure the discussion. And it would also allow you to say, taking one of these off does not mean that it's not important to the community. I will say that for sure, because they do play with one another. Maybe they're a different way of saying it. Maybe there are some that are, like, for example, keeping siblings at the same school. That's something that you can look into in the implementation portion of this work. But if that's something that you want up front, that is a totally different criteria that I have to work with than keeping that until the end, right? So there are some of these, if you want to eliminate islands, I got to put that at the forefront of this work. If that's a lower piece and you are looking for balanced demographics, then you might need to keep islands. So there are these things that paring this down and coming up with your 5 or 6 just makes it more local to your committee and gives me better direction.
I'm gonna go to a couple people online, but just to add a little bit in here for people who are watching at home or are going to send me an email. McKay is from the other Portland, not from this Portland. So when she says get rid of islands, she means enrollment islands, not cliff and peaks and all of that. So that's
Nope.
don't send me an email about it.
Nope.
But I think one of the things you could also think about within this, and then Kate, I'm going to go to you online. One of the ways to also think about this is actually to use Priscilla's comment as an example, is if there's priorities within an area where local context really matters, to also feel free to share that, right? So within demographics for Portland, we really need to think about our McKinney-Vento student population, and that's of priority for this committee. Let's name that. And recognizing that probably in this time, it's too premature right now to get to a full prioritization. So let's not try to push to that. Let's get just sort of out on the table so that she has in her mind before she leaves here, what are the big things that you guys are thinking about, so that when she leaves, that's what she can do. And we can come back and say, here's what we heard. Let's test this. Okay. So Kate.
Thank you. Kate Knox, I wasn't here last time, so nice to see you all. I'm a parent. I have 3 kids here in Portland schools. I just had a question for McKay, which maybe she's going to answer this and make me feel silly, but why wouldn't siblings be in the same school? So for example, I have 3 children. They're all going to LISF. So what is the situation I guess I need to understand that more.
So this gets in, that specific guiding principle gets into, that's why I mentioned implementation. If a study area is moved from one attendance area to another, the implementation, you might have a third grader and a kindergartner. So you might say, hey, let's do a phased implementation where that third grader can finish out until fifth grade when they would be going on to middle school anyways.
Okay.
Instead of that third grader has to, the next year, the third grader has to go to that next school, and your first grader has to go to that next school, I guess. So it is a way to look at, yeah, if it's phased implementation and you say third, fourth, and fifth get to stay for the rest of their, and your first grader now is at a different school than your third grader. So it gets more to the phased implementation. So is it a guiding principle that is easy to accomplish or like have at the forefront of a goal for this beginning work? In my opinion, it's not, but I also don't want to imply that I know what is important to this community.
Okay, thank you. And I think, Ryan, I mean, they're hard. They're really hard to, I know we're not supposed to be ranking them, but it's hard because when you read them all together, they all have a degree of importance, right? That you're like, yes, all these things need to go together. If you're asking for things that sort of bubble up to the top, for me, it would be neighborhood schools. It would be evening out our utilization. You know, we just have a couple schools that are just bursting, and then we have a couple schools with, you know, that aren't, like Longfellow. Evening out usage. And for me personally, that demographics, I think it's B, around socioeconomic, linguistic, and diversity is incredibly important to me. So I want to see that. I know I actually really appreciate the comment about for socioeconomic, if we have 50%, you know, we can't, people live where they live. So we may not be able to get to 100, but to me, that's important. I know we see a lot of sort of divisions when we get to the high school level because of school choice. I would like to see us try to minimize those and keep a level of all those kinds of diversity weaving through our elementary and middle to the degree we can do that while balancing these other things.
That's really helpful, Kate. And I think helpful in the conversation, even like to hear the prioritization and the weighting you place on it. Annie.
Sorry, I know I talk a lot. But I'm a sociologist and at a research conference right now, so this is like really my jam. So I would love, so one, that list of potential priorities or things to consider, like one, I think I want to remind us all that that is not an exhaustive list. We can still add to it. And the other thing is I would love to just go one by one through the existing list and say, why do we care about this thing? What do we think it's going to bring to Portland and our students and our families? And so I'd love to do that because some of the things I see on there, and I have a guess why they might be important to some people, but I'm not completely sure. Can we do that as an exercise?
I mean, I'm certainly open to any of the pieces, right? I am sort of the default chair for today just because Sarah ran into an issue on the way here. And so filling in for that. So happy to do that. I also want to be conscious of time, right? So it's 6:25 now. And so we can do that. We can also pick it back up at the next conversation. And so I'm like open, I'm looking around at the committee to get a read from you all.
I guess I'm wondering just in interim chair capacity, I don't have a great sense. McKay gave us the sort of timeline, and as you said to us at the first meeting, it's quite an escalated timeline. And it doesn't feel to me like we probably got where the hope was we would get to in this meeting, and we don't meet again for a month. So do we consider doing some asynchronous work in between meetings? I'm open to that.
I was just thinking along those same lines of, I have a survey that, and it might not get to exactly what you're talking about, where you can hear everyone's input, but the survey that we have used in the past can help to, if everyone takes it, it's a very short survey, but it kind of gets at what is important to you and your community when embarking on a boundary review process. That can also, those automatically start rising certain things to the top. And that could allow at least us to narrow this down. And then maybe it is, hey, McKay, you left this off. This has to be on here. But it could be a way of surveying you all and then concatenating that feedback. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but it could be a way to work a little bit while we're not together and come back and really have some informed discussion.
Yeah, I'll say I think we should try to conclude close to 6:30. And I think we did get some great information today, and appreciate that. I like the idea of participating, between this meeting and the next one through a survey or some kind of other means to try to start weighing some of the priorities. I do think logically, just sort of thinking this through and hearing the answer to, well, what if we took each one of these to the extreme? We can't do that. The one thing that we could do is the status quo, I think, is, the minimize impacts. So thinking that through, I think the one thing we can't not have on there is minimize impacts. I mean, for political, social reasons that are very important to the community, we can't just disrupt for the sake of any of the other factors. I think that's my opinion. So the others, I think, they're all important, but that one is the one we probably can't avoid considering. So, I think it'd be good to look at some scenarios, maybe not the extremes, but like, what's the greatest way to maximize A through D without having huge impacts? I think that would be helpful. And then we can kind of see what's the best approach going forward based on what other people think are the most important factors.
I'm just looking around. I saw some head nods on the piece around 6:30. And so I feel like if that's where people are, I think what I would love to do is take the lead on that, and we will work on some asynchronous homework for folks to do. And I'm going to turn it back to McKay to just walk through sort of how the process plays out, because, well, having the conversation I think was really helpful, because, I mean, it's both helpful to have a rule book and say, here are the priorities, and it's helpful to have the conversation and hear from you. And I think we did have that, and we did get a good sense of where people feel like things are important. And so I think there's a good starting spot. And I think more of it will come up as we start to iterate in the process, that we will naturally start to see, all right, this is really a priority for this committee, that will take shape. And so we can sort of see how this evolves. And so with that in mind, McKay, do you want to pull back up the slides and do the last one just to talk about the iterative process? Yes.
Yep. And I will say I ran the closest to home model just while we were talking, and it's actually, I'm a little bit shocked. It is actually, you have very good, it's very close. Maybe that's partially because of the islands that automatically make closest to home, but other than there's a little bit at the southwest, and I think that's because of natural barriers. So for what it's worth, you guys are kind of in good shape on closest to home. As the crow flies. So this is, oh, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? And it's at the 30 mark. Okay, hold on. Share screen. Okay, this is a look forward to kind of this iterative model, right? I'm going to create the initial scenarios, looking at these guiding principles. And I know you didn't decide any in stone tonight. That's okay, because I want you to know I'm very thorough with looking at all of these pieces, and it's not my job to wreck a community or I'm really thinking about how can we better all students. I'm a very big district-wide thinker. My favorite committee member was a mom of 5 kids, a single mom of 5 kids, who voted for the change and affected all of her 5 kids. So that's where I like to put myself in thinking that if it benefits the district, then that's where my work is. So we start off with the initial scenarios, then we get feedback from the leadership. We go back to committee. Committee, you're going to create your scenario 1. Then we go back through and look at, okay, this is pretty good, but it missed A, B, C, and D. You guys say, let's look at this area or this area or this area. I go back to the drawing board. It goes through district leadership. It comes to committee scenario 2. This can go up to committee scenario 5, 6. There's iterations in between, but these are generally, they are building off of one another. This is pretty good, but is there another way, or is there a way to build off of this? Once you get to something that you're fairly comfortable with, I like to be around 85, 90% confident that this is a direction that you all want to go in. Then we bring it out to the community. We have a community forum. We get input and feedback from the community. We take that back. I modify the scenario, the draft scenario, pass that by district leadership, and you all one more time. We do some tweaks, and that ends up with the final recommendation that goes to the board for vote. So very iterative. Again, we're doing our due diligence to see what doesn't work and what's going to work best for all students. And I appreciate you all having me here today. And again, sorry for bringing the rain.
Ariel, do you want to ask a quick question?
Yeah, just curious what we should be doing with the questions we wrote down and didn't get to.
Yeah, so I will, today's Thursday, so by Monday, I will send you guys some follow-up. We will think about what that is. Within that, I'll capture your questions, and we will share them with McKay so that we can get, for everybody on the committee, one set of both the questions and the answers, as well as to the public, so they can see what the questions were as well as what the answers are, so that everybody has the same information, so that we're as transparent as possible on this. I really appreciate the discussion. It's a heavy task that you guys are charged with in terms of making a recommendation to the board about any and all changes. And so I appreciate that we're dipping our toes in here and starting this. Our next meeting is scheduled for October 24th. One of the things I'll ask for just for you from feedback is whether you prefer the hybrid format with in-person as an option or just on Zoom. I'm open to either of them, just whatever makes it most comfortable for conversation, and look out for that email around Monday. All right. Thank you all. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you all.